Good evening and good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this program. My name is Param Shivan. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program, and we'll bring on Mr. Nihis, Professor Biman Prasad. But let's move ahead. Thank you for those who are joining in, and it's a wonderful pleasure to have you on board. Those who are joining me from anywhere, any part of the world, welcome to this program. My name is Param Shivan. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and Pulavinaka. My name is Param Shivan and I reside in Sydney, Australia. Welcome to this live stream. And if you're new to this, subscribe to my YouTube channel and Fiji Indian TV page group. Though not a seasoned professional in journalism, but I shall do well with Professor Biman. As I fire my questions, please note that I do not condone or intend to derail the current political status in Fiji. Neither do I have any invested interest in any political party. I wish to stay neutral and unbiased, and I do not own or take any responsibility for the answers given today. My intent is primarily to promote awareness. Today in live stream, we have Professor Biman Prasad. Professor Biman Prasad is a political leader of National Federation Party. He is currently the leader of the National Federation Party. Prasad was born in Raketi, Banwa, Levu, Fiji. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and Economics from the University of South Pacific. He pursued a Masters of Commerce from the University of New South Wales in Sydney and Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Queensland. Prasad became the lecturer of the University of South Pacific in 1986, head of the School of Economics from 2003 and 2007, professor of economics and dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics from 2007 and 2011. In April 2014, Prasad resigned as Professor of Economics from the University of South Pacific to pursue a political career. As he dusted off the feathers from his coat in the 1999 election for the National Federation Party, it was now looking back for him. In 2014, he was elected as a leader of the NFP, and he competed with winning about 8,000 votes over there. He was re-elected at the 2018 elections, winning by 12,000 votes. And here he is today, joining with me live all the way from Fiji. Please welcome Professor Biman. Hello, sir, and welcome to the program. How are you today?
A pleasure to be on this program with you, Pram, and greetings to everyone who's watching this live.
Yes, of course, it's a wonderful pleasure. What's the weather like in Fiji at the moment?
Well, it's a bit chilly. I mean, as you know, June, July is usually the colder months, and
it's supposed to be.
It's been a little bad in Suba. It's been raining for a while, so otherwise, it's pretty pleasant.
Well, Suba is actually meant to be for raining season anyway. By the way, let's get ahead with this lovely afternoon and evening in most of some part of the world. Now, everybody knows Professor Biman, and he knows his history. You can Google and find a lot of details about him. But today I'm here to know, actually, who is Biman Prasad? And okay, Professor Biman Prasad, who is he as a person? Would you like to tell us, sir, who is Mr. or Professor Biman Prasad as a person? Not as a professional, as a person.
That's a pretty difficult question, but you did say a little bit about that in the introduction. Like many of us in Fiji, we come from a very rural farming background. I come from a very large family, a family of 7 brothers and 6 sisters. We had a rice farm. And all the way from Raketi, finally to Lambasa College, and then on to the university, and the rest is history, I guess.
Yes, of course. And now, since when did you started into politics? Like, how did you come into politics? I know how you.
Well, as a student at the University of the South Pacific, you come in contact with the students from 12, 13 different countries. And student activism around that time in the 80s is is very different, or was very different from what we have today.
Mm-hmm.
Students were very, very active. We were concerned about what was happening in the country. I became a student leader, and so I understood very early. People say, politics is dirty, politics is this, that,
Of course.
but politics can also be a force for good. And
Mm-hmm.
I think even though we are not, even though many people are not in politics directly,
Mm-hmm.
politics defines a lot of things about how people live in a particular country. Policies and so on are determined by politicians
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day. So my interest in politics, grew out of that kind of thinking and that kind of understanding. And I still believe that politics can be a force for good,
Mm-hmm.
uh, although it's a very difficult situation when you get into politics. It's not
Yes, very
easy.
true.
There are a lot
Very
of
true.
challenges, both
Yes.
personally and professionally. And so yes, I mean, but at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
it can be very satisfying, if you're able to achieve good for the country, good for the people, both in
Yes.
terms of policies as well as how we can take the country forward. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, I mean, people have very, very different views about politics. I know there would be many people watching this program, who would have very, very different views to what I have. That's
Of
fine,
course.
and I've
Yes.
always accepted different views and welcome, people's
Yes.
criticism of our policies and what we do as politicians.
Mm-hmm.
And when you come into politics, you put yourself out there in the public, and you expect people to raise, some very, very difficult questions, to say very, very harsh things about, what you say
And
and
you're
what you
always
don't
on the
say.
firing line.
So all that is part and parcel of political.
Yes.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean that's true. But you also have people who appreciate what you do,
It's
and
very true.
people do give you the advice quite freely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes very unsolicited, but that's fine. I think that's the nature of what politics is all
Yes.
about. I suppose in every other country it's probably the same.
Yes. Now, so tell me, you had a well-paid job at the university. Now, why did you take leave a well-paid job and join the politics?
Well, personally, I was very disappointed when the coup happened in 2006. As you
Mm-hmm.
know, Fiji has
Yes.
gone
Yes.
through 4 coups.
Yes.
We and many people living in Australia, New Zealand, US today, especially people from Fiji,
Mm-hmm.
understand this very well. And so my disappointment with what happened in 2006,
Mm-hmm.
is a reflection of what happened in 87 and 2000. And so I was very, very disappointed that a democratically elected government
Mm-hmm.
was removed by the military, and then we went into an interim government period, and we had a new constitution put in place in
Mm-hmm.
2013. And so I saw this as an opportunity. I was very optimistic that, okay, whatever we might think about the 2013 constitution, at
Mm-hmm.
least we are moving into a parliamentary
Moving ahead. True.
democracy. And I saw myself as somebody who could contribute,
Mm-hmm.
towards making Fiji better, and bring about genuine democracy in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Although I remain to this day, after 6 years in Parliament,
Mm-hmm.
very, very disappointed as to where the country is heading and how we are doing in terms of democracy, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
freedom, in terms of all other aspects of how we make policies.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another issue, and
Yes, it's
I
very true.
have been able to articulate many of those inside Parliament and outside Parliament, and
Mm-hmm.
will continue to do so as long as I'm in politics.
Now, any person, they have an interest in politics or soccer or any other field, for instance. Now, you would have a favorite politician. Do you have a favorite politician?
Well, I mean, there are many great politicians
Mm-hmm.
around the world from whom we can learn, and I read a lot, right from people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King,
Okay.
and many others
Mm-hmm.
more recently. But I think we've had some very good politicians here in Fiji, and I had I was fortunate to be associated with the National Federation Party when
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Jairam Reddy, or Justice Jairam Reddy, was the leader of the party. I contested an election at his request in 1999.
Mm-hmm.
I had an opportunity to meet the former leader of the National Federation Party, the founder leader, not Mr. Edi Patel, but Mr. Siddiq Koya. And I
Okay.
remember meeting him in 1992.
You're a
So
young boy
a
then.
lot of these leaders were very, very inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
The level of contribution they made,
Mm-hmm.
even though they were in opposition. I also studied Ratu Sekam Semara. There was a fellowship, yes, a fellowship established
Mm-hmm.
by the Otago University, and so I was the first recipient of that fellowship as a
Mm-hmm.
visiting professor to Otago University in 2007.
And what do you think
And I
Ratumara
had
as a
the opportunity to read a lot about him as
mm-hmm.
well. And these were leaders, who could come together,
Mm-hmm.
who, despite differences of opinion, differences of views about how
Mm-hmm.
politics should be conducted, were able to talk to each other and got together to make Fiji.
A
In,
better
in,
place.
in many ways where it is today. I mean, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the development that took place in the 70s and the 80s
True.
was done through a bipartisan approach. I mean, if you look at the if you look at the sugar industry,
Mm-hmm.
in the 70s and 80s, it was Ratumara, SM Koya, and later on Jairam Reddy, working together. We always used to have this parliamentary sugar select committee,
Mm-hmm.
and both the opposition and the government, work together on some of these big projects. So there was genuine desire amongst the leaders at that time
Mm-hmm.
to work in a bipartisan manner and take the country forward. And there are many lessons that we can learn from those kind of experiences.
Mm-hmm. So where is the country heading towards? Today, for example. I mean, if you look at the 70s and the 80s, it was a wonderful era. I was reading about it, and of course, yes, you've reiterated that well. But where is the country heading today?
I can't hear you, Param. Are you?
Okay. Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you well and clear, and I think the feed may have a little bit of trouble. But can you hear me now? Hello. Can you hear me now? Raju, can you hear me? You should be able to hear me. I can hear you. So, yes, we are live from Fiji with the Professor Biman. And apologies for the technical difficulties. It keeps on happening because of probably the internet and the issues we always have. But nevertheless, I'm sure he is back and he is able to hear me. And just nod and give a thumbs up when you can hear me. And today we have, as I said, Professor Biman. He's from Fiji and he's live from Fiji. And ladies and gentlemen, we will be taking some questions in the later part of
Well,
the program.
as I said, I wrote this
Yes.
paper some time back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I can hear you now, and
Okay.
just sort of responding to your question about where the where the
Country is heading
countries
today. Heading today.
where the country is heading, in terms of what.
Well, he seemed to have dropped out, but he will definitely come back. And those who are tuned in, thank you for being tuned in. It's Professor Biman. We do have some internet issues, and possibly there is, sometimes what happens is current government. Yes, we'll be taking some questions as Professor Biman joins us again. And in the later part of the program, we will allowed to take some questions. And hello and welcome to this program. He's just dropped out of the feed, but he'll be back shortly. And do not ask any questions now. Leave it to the later part of the interview, and Professor will definitely getting onto those questions with you. So stay tuned. And if you've got any other interesting questions, by the way, challenging and interesting questions, you may be able to direct those questions to me. And I know those people that are watching this program currently are thinking that this program is actually funded by some sort of manner. Now, I reached out to Professor Biman via Ranjit Raju, who is actually the associate and he's a little active member in the National Federation Party. So I reached out to him and said, look, what's happening in Fiji? Let's have a little bit of a chit chat and let's get together an insight as to what's happening in Fiji. So he's back and let's get him back on the stream. Welcome back, Professor. Welcome back to the stream. Can you hear me now?
Thank you. I think thank you. Yeah. We had a bit of glitch there, I think.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead, Pra. Yeah.
Yes, we were talking about where is the country heading
I didn't
today.
hear what you said earlier.
Where is the country heading?
Well, as I said, if you look at the 70s and the 80s, let me just answer that. And if you look at what we achieved in the 70s and the 80s, and if you compare Fiji with the countries like Mauritius at that time, before the 1987 coup, Fiji was doing better on almost all the indicators than Mauritius. But after the 87 coup and the subsequent coups of 2000 and 2006, we've had a lot of setbacks. And I think we are still trying to struggle. And given the onslaught of the pandemic, this is going to have a very, very serious impact as to how we progress in the future. And a lot of thinking and planning will have to go in to see how the country can be repositioned once, we settled with this pandemic. And how we can take it forward.
Okay, that sounds nice. Now, as we are loud and clear, and Professor is back, and ladies and gentlemen, as I said, we will be taking some questions later part of the program. And as I said, the internet speed does, play up a little bit. But nevertheless, we are back. Now, Professor, most important question, I suppose everybody's tuned in to find out as to what is happening. Myself, I actually reached out to Ranjit and then obviously yourself to find out what is actually happening in Fiji. There are sick, people are dying. Now what's happening? Could you tell me what's happening as far as COVID is concerned? That's the biggest concern worldwide. I know it's the biggest concern worldwide, but in Fiji, what's happening?
Well, we had the pandemic started in 2020, and for a year, we were COVID-free, but we have a second wave, and this has largely happened because of the lapses in the quarantine, and we have the new Delta variant now creating havoc in the country and more so in Viti Levu, and particularly around Suba, Nosori, and Lemi areas. The numbers have risen exponentially. And this, you can trace this quite clearly. When we had containment zones and we opened it up, numbers have just grown exponentially, and now we are having a very, very serious issue. Unfortunately, there's been very, very contradictory containment policies by this government. The Ministry of Health is saying something else, other ministers are saying something else. We have opened up all kinds of businesses, or we are planning to open up more, but the numbers are rising. And the unfortunate part, Param, now is that people are dying. Our death rate is increasing. Our positivity rate, in terms of the number of people who are being tested and the number of people who are being diagnosed with the.
Yes, we've lost him again, ladies and gentlemen, but he should be back. And yeah, it's I know it's kind of irritating as far as speed is concerned, because I think a lot of people are chewing up the internet.
Is quite is dire, and it's not expected to. Yeah. Well, as I said, the situation, in my view, is dire now. Our health systems are totally stressed. But not only, the concern is about how the government is dealing with the spread of the virus. I think, uh, by WHO definition,
Mm-hmm.
the virus is out of control. There seems to be total community transmission now in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And our view, and many in the opposition and outside of the opposition, and if you look at international research, if you look at what's happening in Australia, I was just reading
Mm-hmm.
what prominent epidemiologists, professors in Australia and New Zealand are saying. And the strategy that Australia and New Zealand is adopting is the right one. I mean, they go for immediate hard lockdown to stop the arrest of the virus. The
Mm-hmm.
vaccination process is always there, and we're encouraging everyone to get vaccinated in Fiji. But the virus is spreading now, and people are dying. People are arriving, into the hospital, or they arrive dead in the hospitals now
Mm-hmm.
because the number of cases are increasing, and people do not have all the healthcare. I mean, I understand that any healthcare system would be stretched, if the number of cases keep increasing. So we still think that the government needs to change its strategy. It needs to look at the experiences of other countries, and we're a small country. We have got a small economy. We're a
Mm-hmm.
tourism dependent economy, and for us, arresting the spread of the virus right now should be the most important consideration in any
Mm-hmm.
decision that the government is making. We also need to ensure that while we are putting in all these strategies to stop the spread of the virus, we also
Mm-hmm.
need to look after our people. There are thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who have lost jobs, who have lost income, who are struggling to put food on the table. And here, Param, I just wanted
Mm-hmm.
to make this point, and I want to thank all our people who are living in Australia, New Zealand, US, Canada, and
Mm-hmm.
other places. Last year, we received almost $652 million.
Well, we just lost him there once again, and he will be back. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for those who are tuning in and watching our program. And do let us know in the feed where are you calling from or why are you watching this program. Now, today is Sunday, and it's 1 p.m. around 1 p.m. in Fiji. So there's possibly a lot of people watching this program and chewing up the internet. Now, we are doing our very best to get back to him, but nevertheless, he will be back with us. And if you have any questions, by the way, as I said earlier, uh, please do let me know and write him in the feed, and we will get back to you. So we're back again. Yes. Okay. Cool. Thank you. You're right there. I can hear
Yeah,
you.
sorry about
It
the.
happens.
I don't know where it's coming from, but we.
I think it was
Yeah,
sabotage today.
yeah. So what I was saying.
Hmm.
Um, what I was saying is, I just wanted to make this point, that
Hmm.
there are a lot of people suffering in this country. Even before COVID,
Hmm.
we had about 30% of the people living below the poverty line. And so, if you add, another 15 to 20% who might have dropped below the poverty line because many have lost jobs, many have lost income. So
Hmm.
essentially, you're looking at close to about 400,000 people struggling to make ends meet. Which if you take an average of about four people in a family, you're looking
Hmm.
at about 100,000 families. And here I want to thank all those people who are living in Australia, New Zealand, former Fiji citizens,
Hmm.
Australia, New Zealand, US, Canada, America, and any other place. Last year, we received almost $652 million in remittances. And imagine if we hadn't got that remittances, into the country, our situation would be worse. And I know many of you, living there, you send money to your families, your friends, your village, your settlement. And I think it is important for us to thank all those people who are doing that.
So,
Of course,
Professor, it was just
government doesn't have the money in many ways to look after so many people who would be needing support. And we know that our donor partners, Australia and New Zealand, have been providing a lot of support, and I think it's important to thank all of them, all the donor partners. If it was not for them, I think the situation would be even worse and dire, in terms of how we are going to arrest the COVID cases.
now, as you said, you mentioned
Yeah, go ahead, Param.
$652 million in remittance.
Go ahead. I
$652 is
can't hear you.
as you mentioned, $652 million in remittance. I think we'll change it to a little Bluetooth headphone so he'd be able to hear. And
I think we should have done it on Zoom, no? And then,
Zoom may also be quite weak because of the internet speed. Nevertheless, so those who are tuned in, please be known that Professor Biman is in Fiji, and due to network speed, he should be back, but he is there, and I'm just trying to see if he can listen to me. He just might need to be connected with the headphone so he can hear us clearly, and possibly which is chewing up the net as well. By the way, as you've heard, $652 million in remittance for those people. And according to the statistics, there is about 90,000 people living in Sydney alone, in Australia alone. So that's quite a lot of people living in second Fijians out of Fiji. So can you hear me there, Professor? Hello. I think the technical team is trying to fix something out there.
I can hear you now, Param.
Okay. Okay, you can hear me now well and clear. I was just reiterating about the $652 million sent by our people from overseas, and that's a lot of money, and yet there's no
I can
way.
hear you now.
Yes, the government has never been published or stated anywhere about the remittance.
I can hear you clearly now.
Okay, thanks.
But
so you can hear me clearly now, so you can proceed, Professor. Congestion in Fiji, obviously.
I can hear you, but you're breaking quite a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of congestion, I suppose. People trying, it being Sunday, and I think people are watching this not just around your area, possibly, and they're all trying to watch and get net congestion. So that's what the technical team is saying. Unfortunately, if you can hear me, I'll let you go ahead.
No, that's been published by the Reserve Bank. That's the figures. That's the figures from the Reserve Bank.
So he's dropped out again, and let me see 1 second. I'll just suggest something, and he should be back. Ladies and gentlemen, we will definitely counteract this in one form or manner. But yes, as he said, $652 million. And now later I will be talking to him regarding the deficit of this country, especially Fiji. And then you will have an idea for those people who are watching this, that internet issues. Yes, of course, internet issues. Yes, okay. Okay, you're back again, Prof. There.
Yeah,
Okay, let's go ahead.
go
Okay.
ahead. I can hear you now.
It happens. The congestion happens, and hopefully, we request the Fiji government to do something about the infrastructure of the communications over there.
I'm not sure if the congestion is because of me.
Don't think so. Don't think so. Now let's proceed and let's proceed with this program. And would like to apologize to those people who are trying very hard to connect to this feed. And so let's go ahead. Uh, so now, Professor, tell me, how would you counteract this? Now, at the moment, the country is going into a lot of problem. There's a lot of health issues as far as COVID is concerned. And as you mentioned, that the government is asking all the businesses to stay open. People are freely moving. How would you, as a person, as a member of a parliament, counteract that? Would you bring out
Well,
what
we
policies would you do?
we we have said very clearly right from the time when the this variant actually hit Fiji. It's the second wave,
Hmm.
and we went into containment zones. That was the right thing to do. But then the government decided to open up these containment zones, and then
Hmm.
they decided to ease on the opening of all the businesses, and
Hmm.
they even opened up businesses like hairdressers, and
Hmm.
now they're talking about opening up bars and restaurants and gyms. Now, in my view, that's crazy. I think what the focus should be now is to control the spread of the virus, and some well-planned lockdown is what is needed. Lockdown doesn't
Hmm.
mean they were saying 28 days lockdown, curfew. If you look at lockdown in Australia and New Zealand, people are asked to stay home, but they're allowed to
Hmm.
go and get their groceries, or they go to the pharmacies, or if they have
Essentials.
medical issues. Now, the permanent secretary for health here is quite clearly saying that people must
Hmm.
stay home. You only get out when you need to go for groceries or essential requirements like medicine, or if you are sick.
Hmm.
But on other arms of government have all decided that businesses should open.
Hmm.
So I think government needs to change the strategy, change its
Hmm.
course. We may need more support from our international partners,
Hmm.
because, as I said, government doesn't seem to have that kind of resources to look after the people when
Hmm.
they're in lockdown. It's not Australia, New Zealand, where people have incomes. There are a lot of people who, if you ask them to stay home for 2 weeks or 3 weeks without jobs, would be finding it very, very difficult. And
Hmm.
these people need to be supported either with food rations or whatever support that I know government has provided. Some intermittent support, like providing
Hmm.
$90 to families and then $50. They're also trying to distribute some ration, but this is all piecemeal. It is not arresting the spread of the virus. The government, it seems to be putting all its egg in one basket
Hmm.
and saying, let's have vaccination. That's fine. We all support vaccination. I'm urging everyone in the country to get vaccinated, but that's in the future. We will take about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months to get the
Hmm.
80% targeted population that needs to be vaccinated. But in
Now.
the meantime, the virus
Hmm.
is spreading, the virus is killing people, people are dying. And we need to have a strategy to address that as well. And I think
Hmm.
a targeted, well planned lockdown, and if we need to ask for resources from our international partners and donors, we should do
Hmm.
that now, because we can't let the virus out of control, and we can't expect people to continue to die from this, because it will also have a very disastrous impact on the economy. The longer this virus stays, the
Hmm.
longer, because even though government is saying open up, a lot of businesses are not opening up, people are not there, people don't have
Hmm.
income. So you're not going to help the economy too,
Hmm.
if the virus continues to spread in a big way. So I think that the government strategy is wrong when we are calling on again, even
Hmm. Hmm.
through this platform, that the government needs to look back, swallow some of his pride, and not be arrogant about how we're going to deal with this virus. This virus is not people.
Now,
It
has
can't be dealt with other means. It has to be dealt with in a scientific way, in an
Mhm,
economically feasible way,
mhm.
and way in which other countries have been able to, and our neighbors Australia and New Zealand provide us with very good examples of how we can do that.
Now, has Australia or New Zealand offered any benefits? I know they have allocated 250,000 from New Zealand doses of injection, 50,000 doses of injections coming from Australia. Now, according to New Zealand radio sources, they're saying they're actually willing to give about $10 million towards the COVID-19 response. Now, is this in the form of medication or health support or cash coming into the country?
Well, as I said, we are eternally grateful to our neighbors, particularly Australia and New Zealand. They provided, budget support, in terms
Hmm.
of, millions of dollars. Australia and New Zealand put together some time back, contributed almost about $115 million for budget support. They've been providing a lot of support, in terms of technical assistance. We have
Hmm.
Australia, New Zealand medical teams now in Fiji, helping our health officials. So, as I said, if we didn't have Australia, New Zealand right on the doorsteps, willingly, and openly, trying to support how we are able to contain this virus, we would be in a very, very terrible situation, Param.
Now, so your best option would be to close down for 2 weeks, like close all the businesses or something for 2 weeks.
Well, I'm not saying, whether it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks.
Hmm.
I think what the science and what the economics is saying is that, the virus is spreading exponentially. It's
Hmm.
out in the community. It's having disastrous impact on the health systems. People
Hmm.
who don't have COVID are also suffering because they can't access, medical services because our health systems are totally stretched. But it's
Hmm.
also affecting the economy, and in the long run, we will do more damage to the economy by not arresting the virus. So, I think the government and the health officials, and if we need assistance internationally, we should call for that and
Hmm.
make sure that we control the virus. Whether it is after 2 weeks lockdown or 3 weeks of lockdown, that has to be decided on the basis of where the situation is in terms of how bad it is, how
Hmm.
widespread the virus is in the community. All these factors, only the experts would be able to do.
Hmm.
But the point I'm making is that the spread of the virus needs to be arrested.
Hmm.
It needs to be controlled. Before we see that we have the situation under control. And in the
Hmm.
meantime, we make sure that as many people as possible, our target population that needs to be vaccinated,
Vaccinated.
is done. And here, I think Australia, New Zealand have provided the AstraZeneca vaccine, and
Yes.
we are very, very grateful for that help, because there are many countries out there in the world, who are having difficulty in
Yes.
procuring and receiving vaccines. So we are quite
Hmm.
lucky in this country that we have Australia and New Zealand, who have, quite
Hmm.
urgently and quickly, made the vaccines available
Hmm.
in Fiji, and many people are getting vaccinated. So that program should continue, and we all are urging people to not be hesitant. Just go and get vaccinated
Hmm.
as much as you can, and as soon as you can.
Now, are
But
people getting vaccinated?
I think the number of people who've got the first dose is quite
Hmm.
good. I think it's over 50% already.
Hmm.
The people are getting the second jab, but there is an element of hesitancy on some people. But
Hmm.
I think we need to get our messaging right. We are calling ourselves, as leaders, for everyone to vaccinate. But
Hmm.
and that can be done, through proper education, through proper advocacy, and how
Hmm.
we can get people to understand the importance of getting everyone vaccinated in the long term, and in the importance of vaccination, for restoring the health of our economy, particularly our tourism industry.
Hmm. Now, what percentage is the tourism industry that brings the income into the country?
Well, Param, that's well known. I mean, 40% of our GDP, roughly about 40% of
Yes.
our GDP comes from the tourism industry, and that industry
Hmm.
is totally ravaged, devastated,
Hmm.
and it is going to be some time, before we are able to get the tourism industry back on its feet. And one big factor as to
Hmm.
when and how efficiently and in what volume we are able to bring the tourism industry back will depend on how we are able to deal with this virus, and and
Coronavirus, yes.
and and how quickly we can get to zero cases in this country. So
Hmm.
that's a long, hard, challenging question in front of us, and
Hmm.
uncertainty in front of us as to when we would be able to do that and when we can get the tourism industry back on its feet.
So the government is quite aware of the 40% income, which is the tourism industry is coming from the tourism industry, and basically it's zero at the moment. So now, where is the money coming from? How is the government going to, survive? How is the country going to survive? And obviously, the deficit is going to pile up and pile up and pile up.
Well, there are two things I want to say on that question, Param. One, of course,
Hmm.
is government's economic situation was already bad, even before the onslaught of the pandemic. For example, in
Hmm.
2019, the economy experienced negative growth. And over the last several years, this government has been borrowing and spending, and as I said in one of the conversations, like drunks in a nightclub, as if there is
Hmm.
no tomorrow.
Hmm.
Now we've been hit by this pandemic. Nobody expected this pandemic, and nobody ever projected, the magnitude of the impact that this pandemic will have on the economy. We are
Hmm.
in a serious economic situation. We As I said, we're getting budget support from Australia and New Zealand because we
Hmm.
don't have the revenue capacity, and perhaps we don't have much room to borrow as much as we would have liked to borrow. In fact,
Hmm.
in a situation like this, when you have a very, very depressed economic environment, the only thing that can be done is in a big way is government spending, and many
Hmm.
governments around the world have borrowed more to spend money to make sure that the demand in the economy remains, and people are helped. And I think what we need to concentrate, and this is what I've said, and I hope that the next budget, whatever the size of that budget, I don't think the
Hmm.
budget could be the same size, $3.6 billion that we had in the last budget. But
Hmm.
whatever the budget that this government is going to come out, and we've said this before, that's kind of our submission, that the government needs to concentrate on
Hmm.
making sure that we address the health issue, we address the issue of education and income support for our people, because concentrating on these three important things in a crisis of this nature
Hmm.
is itself going to help the economy, but it will also ensure that people are not left behind, people are not going to go hungry, and that
Hmm.
people's health, uh, apart from COVID issues, are provided for, and that people are looked after. And
Hmm.
that is what I would think that the next budget should do. Um, as you said quite rightly, we shouldn't expect too much from this budget, because government physical space, the ability
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
borrow more and the ability to collect more revenue, it's
Hmm.
all gone.
Hmm.
And we are hoping that we would have support from our international partners, international organizations like the IMF, World Bank,
Hmm.
Asian Development Bank, and others, um, for us to be able to sustain, this
Hmm.
very, very difficult economic period,
Hmm.
and to sustain the livelihoods of our people. Many people, as I said, I gave you some statistics.
Hmm.
It's quite horrendous. I mean, the number of people who would have slipped into poverty
Hmm.
is quite quite big. I said, close to about, 100,000 families. If you add 20%, who might have slipped further to the 30% who are already there. Now, that kind of scenario requires any government to make sure that we look after the people, which means income support, supporting the livelihoods, looking after education and health. And once we are able to restore some economic health back and also to deal with the coronavirus, up to a point where we might have zero cases, where, tourists start coming back to Fiji, then, we need to, we can look at other issues. But right now, for the next 2 years, that should be the focus of any government, which is compassionate, which knows that people are suffering.
Now, with the next 2 years, as you suggested, the deficit would be quite a big, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the deficit was already, our debt level has been rising well before we were hit by the COVID pandemic. So,
Can you
that's
quote
well
a
known.
figure, sir?
Everybody,
Can
yeah,
you quote a figure?
everybody's. Well, I think the debt to GDP ratio, as part of the budget, last budget was projected to be around 80%. We have to look at the actual figure right now as to what's the actual budget, what's the actual debt repayment, so that we'll be able to. But I think it's well over 7 billion, in terms
Wow.
of the total debt.
So the next 2 years, it's supposed to rise and get worse. Now, it seems like that the most important thing is to get COVID under control. And now you yourself in the National Federation Party, part of the opposition party, now with the Sudelpa, how are you parliamentarians working towards that? Are you providing any support to the other ruling party? Has there been any understanding? Any are both parties coming together to help and fight this situation?
Well, Param, that's a very good question, and I alluded to you earlier about how leaders in the past used to come into a bipartisan manner and work towards taking the country forward. When the COVID pandemic hit Fiji last year, I actually wrote to the Prime Minister, all our members of Parliament, and I think the leader of the opposition at that time also wrote to him, offering our willingness to work with government in bringing out a COVID response budget. And we never got an even acknowledgement from the Prime Minister, to our letters. So, a lot of people say, work with the government, but we have tried, in the last, personally, I've tried in the last, 5 or 6 years, well before COVID, suggesting to government on a number of occasions to work together to have bipartisan committee. But this government is so arrogant. It's full of this false sense of bravado and bravery that what they're doing is right. They do not care about listening to what the opposition is saying and what other comment. It's not only us who are now complaining about government not listening. I mean, if you look at all the NGOs, if you look at the women's organizations, if you look at people in the community, they're all saying the same thing, that this government has become so arrogant. It is not listening to the people, and it is not listening to alternative views. Any government worth its salt, in any democracy, and especially when you have a crisis, you look at, I mean, you have this, the robust debate in Australia, in New Zealand, where the opposition will get onto the back of the government and question the Prime Minister and the government on every occasion. That's part of the job that the opposition has to do. We have to hold the government to account, and especially more so in a crisis. If we don't say, I mean, I know people say, why are you...
Lost him there just a little bit on the quite an important topic, but he will be back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. He's back there, of course.
So just coming back, so the job of the opposition, and part of our job is to hold the government to account and to raise, questions at every step. I mean, in New Zealand, for example, April, when they were hit by the first wave, the New Zealand Parliament actually set up a committee chaired by the leader of the opposition to monitor the COVID response of that country. I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
you have the same kind of
Yes.
accountability and robustness in terms of the debate in Australia as well.
Yes.
So
Yes.
people need to understand that we don't control the purse. We are not the
Yes.
treasury, right? It's a government. It's a government which makes the policy. The job of the opposition is to raise questions at every point, make
Mm-hmm.
sure that the government is aware of what the people are saying. We,
Mm-hmm.
Param, morning, afternoon, evening, night, we get calls from our people to
Yes.
say, this is, and our job as leaders in the community is to make that known, whether it's publicly or privately. For example, farmers in the country right now, have issues
Mm-hmm.
about cane payment,
Yes.
and they've signed a petition. They sent it to us. I wrote to the Prime Minister on Friday on behalf of the people,
Mm-hmm.
explaining why the forecast price, or the delivery payment should be based on the $85, not on the forecast price that the government. So this is the kind of things that we are doing, and we're doing it very effectively. The only problem in this
Mm-hmm.
country is that this government doesn't seem to care. In fact, the
Mm-hmm.
Prime Minister in Parliament, in response to one of the members of Parliament, says, "I don't give a damn." I mean, if
Mm.
you have that kind of attitude, and especially in a crisis,
Mm.
you're not going to provide that kind of leadership. And
Mm.
and we are saying we are open. We've said very clearly that we want to work with the government.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, we've reached a point where it is not even worth saying that we want to work with the government, because the government has said it very, very clearly on many occasions that they can't work with the opposition. And in fact, in the last parliament session, there was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
attack on the NGOs or the women's group. And
Mm-hmm.
rightfully, the women's groups, NGOs like Friend, which is doing a marvelous job in terms of looking after our people, who are going hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And I would urge a lot of donors from outside Fiji, to look at organizations like that and put in more money, so that these organizations who have a very clear idea of what's happening in the field, they know the people, and they're very effectively trying to help many of them. And
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage people to donate to those kind of organizations, because we can't wait for this government. We can't expect this
To
government to look after the
allocate
people
funds.
in a way that is needed.
Now the government is they have handed out $90 and they have handed out $50. Is it to all the families or just to those required parties?
No, I think the significant number of people who benefited from that, and we support that.
Mm-hmm.
I think, but $90 for a family and $50 for individuals is not a big amount of money. And if people have lost jobs and do not have income for the last 4 or 5 months, and many for probably more than a year or
Mm-hmm.
more than 18 months, since the onslaught of the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
last year, in since March or April, when the tourism
Mm-hmm.
industry was devastated. So I think there are a lot of people out there who are struggling to make ends meet, and
True.
many, as I said, many of you, people living in Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, many of you are actually helping your families and friends
True.
to keep going. And as I
Mm-hmm.
said, the huge amount of remittances that we're receiving is actually keeping us going and keeping the economy going to a large extent.
Yes, yes, I have noticed as you've quoted $652 million. Now, the people that are reaching out to me is obviously complaining that we're not getting any money, we don't have a job, there's the rents are not being paid. Now, how long can people sustain this?
Well, that's a very good question, Param. I think people are already, as I said, there is a large group of people. As I said, let me just repeat what I said earlier. 30% of the people before COVID crisis were living in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after the COVID crisis, if you add another 20% who would have slipped in because they've lost jobs, and many of these people who are living in poverty, before the crisis were people who would be employed in the informal sector, casual jobs, farming incomes, rural population. Now, many of these communities and households were dependent on, the broader economic interaction, and once that gets disrupted, many of these people have lost jobs. In fact, people in the civil service, people in the professions, in big companies, middle level professionals, many of them probably would still have the job, would be able to work from home. But those in the lower ranks of the income have lost jobs, and in a situation like this, they don't have any income. And so that category of people are already struggling. It's not, they can't sustain the livelihood, and that's the group of people that needs direct intervention from government. And government, in my view, has not been able to develop a systematic plan and allocation. We actually moved a motion in Parliament in the last session, and said, 50 million out of the 115 million that was given by Australia and New Zealand for budget support should be allocated for direct support for families who are struggling.
So what's happened with
And
the
I'm
money then?
hoping, well, that's gone to the budget support. The Minister for Economy, can explain that when he delivers his budget. But what we are saying is that in the next budget, there should be a targeted allocation
Yes.
for increase in social welfare, for income support, for people who are struggling to make ends meet. That would be my concern. The other allocation we'd be looking for is, health. We must make sure that not just COVID, we must make sure that the poor, are able to access medical facilities, medicine in health centers and other places, so that that is not an extra burden on them, apart from the burden of not having the appropriate income to look after themselves. So we would be closely monitoring that and talking about that, and we've already said this. I've been repeating this idea of where the government's focus right now should be: income support, health, and education. Those
Now,
three things.
yes. Now, where is China come into play? Are they providing any support?
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister was reported to have talked to the Chinese presidents. I don't know what sort of support China is going to provide, going forward, whether it's going to be support for budget or, but, China has also provided some support already, like, many other countries. But we are not privy to what future support China is going to provide to Fiji, in terms of budget support.
Now, the election is penned in for next year. Hopefully, the election happens. What do you think is going to happen, or it is going to be deferred?
Well, election can't be deferred. I mean, there is a provision in the Constitution as to when the election ought to be held. It's very clear, and the elections office, as far as we are concerned, is well on its way, in terms of planning and doing what it needs to do to conduct the election. And around the world, countries have had the elections despite the COVID virus, and hopefully, we are able to arrest the spread of the virus in a significant way by the end of this year, and have some semblance of normalcy. And so I don't see any prospect or any reason why there will be no election next year.
Next year. Now, according to you, what do you think? How many months have our education system gone back? Obviously, the students are not getting educated. So how many months or how many weeks have they gone back now in education?
Well, to be fair, we schools, we had some lockdown last year, so students would have missed out on that. We now have schools closed, and this has happened in many places. I think the Ministry of Education has put in place some measures. They have a digital hub. I know there are many teachers, who are working towards making sure that the students are helped while they are at home.
Mm-hmm.
But despite all this support, one thing is very clear, that there will be huge learning and teaching losses that will be experienced by the students.
Mm-hmm.
And my concern really is, in particular, students who come from low income families, students who are slow learners.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, these students would be finding it very, very challenging,
Mm-hmm.
learning from home, and teachers would be finding it very, very challenging to remotely communicate with their students, and to deliver the learning outcomes
Mm-hmm.
that would normally be delivered in a classroom situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what government needs to do, what the Ministry of Education needs to do, is to, while they continue to support these strategies, or put in these strategies and facilitate learning, remotely, they
Mm-hmm.
also need to plan in a big way. And this is where I'm coming from. That when, if and when the school opens, after we've
Mm-hmm.
arrested the spread of the virus, then there has to be extra effort, resources put in to reduce the deficit, or to bring back those learning and teaching that might have been lost,
Mm-hmm.
over this period. Because it's very important. I mean, if students lose, the recovery of that knowledge or the learning that they should have done in a particular class, for example, in class 1 or 2, it
Mm-hmm.
could have a very, very permanent damage on the educational achievements and
Mm-hmm.
outcomes in the future. So I think education of our children is very, very important. This is not only about individuals and families. It could have a devastating impact on the country,
Mm-hmm.
if we do not put in strategies now, so that when the school opens, we're able to recover those learning losses and recover those teaching that ought to have done within a classroom situation.
Yes.
It could be quite a disastrous thing for a country and for the
Mm-hmm.
future of those children and families. So I would think that we need to start putting in a proper plan, so that when the school opens, we must have the resources, we must have the know-how, we
Mm-hmm.
must provide the incentive to the teachers, so that they get on to recovering those learning losses as soon as they get back to their school and within the classroom environment.
Yeah, as to after hearing you for so long, I've never spoken to you. I don't know you. Don't know your, like as a person, I don't know you. I hear you a lot on politics, and I hear your stories. I know you've written books. Now, after hearing your stories, it seems like that you're knocking on the locked door in Parliament. Nothing is happening. Is that what the
Well,
case
I
is?
mean, sometimes when you are in the opposition, Param, you can feel that. But as I
Yes.
said, part of our job in the opposition is to keep knocking,
Yes, of
is
course.
to sometimes, at the expense of repeating
Yes.
what we would have said in the past, because
Mm-hmm.
I think it is important. And I tell you what, I mean, some of the things that we've said in Parliament, the government
Mm-hmm.
might rubbish it initially,
Mm-hmm.
but they actually adopt some of those things that we have put out. I'll give you some example. In 2014, when we said that the guaranteed price of sugar should be $85, it was
Mm-hmm.
rubbish. So
Okay.
when we came to 2018 election and said, from our calculation, that to entice the farmers back into the industry,
Mm-hmm.
to raise production levels, the guaranteed price should be $100. So before the election, the government came out and increased the guaranteed price to $85. In 2014, we said about the VAT, that VAT should be reduced from 15 to 10%. Then
Mm-hmm.
the party, Fiji First Party guys, joked about it. But then
Mm-hmm.
later on in 2016, they reduced the VAT from 15 to not to 10%, but they had to go 1% lower, and that was from 15 to 9%. So they do notice what we say.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's just the pride and the arrogance which might not allow them to admit that what the opposition is saying is correct and needs to be done. But we do achieve our objectives, and I think people need to understand. Sometimes I get comments from people who say, Biman, why are you always criticizing the government? What is your alternative?
Why is
Why
the
don't you do
rising? Why is the lemchos price rising high?
something like that?
Mm-mm-mm.
And the important thing is that in a democracy, I mean, you would understand this
Yes,
better
of
in
course.
Australia. I mean, the opposition doesn't control the purse. The
Yes,
opposition doesn't have the money. The
they don't
money, the
know.
taxpayers pay money to the government. The government is in charge of the money. The
Yes.
opposition's job is to keep knocking onto the government, keep holding the government to account, keep asking questions about every dollar that they use, because
Yes.
it's the taxpayers, it's people like you and others, who pay tax to the government. And the only people who can hold government to account in parliament is the opposition.
Yes, of
So,
course.
and as I said before, and especially when you are in a crisis, every step of the government, every policy that they put out must be scrutinized. Because if you don't, and if they get it wrong, like they've got it wrong now, we've been talking about, government strategy to lock down in a systematic way to control the spread of the virus. The
Yes.
government did the opposite and opened it up, and look what we have today.
The second wave
It's a
there.
disastrous situation.
Yes.
Disastrous situation. And
It's
so
it's
that's the kind of logic that people need to understand when we keep talking about what government should not do and what they should do. It is not just criticism. It's
yes.
holding the government to account on behalf of the people.
Of course, the government, the politicians and the government, they work for the people. But I think it's
Exactly.
changing over there in Fiji. Looks like the people are working for the government.
I mean, if people, if government ministers start thinking that they should not be criticized by the opposition,
Yes.
then there must be something wrong with them.
Well, there's no democracy then, is it?
Exactly.
Okay. Now that's been the insights are very good as far as what's happening in Fiji at the moment. Let's move ahead, and I know COVID is bad at the moment, and you have suggested a few things. Now, before we close off the matter on COVID, have you got any final thing to say regarding COVID? Have you got any message to the public that are actually watching this, the family and friends overseas and abroad, what they can suggest?
Well, the two messages I want to give through your platform, Param. One, of course, is to the people here. I understand their suffering. I understand, the struggles that many of them are going through. But I also want to encourage everyone to get vaccinated as soon as you can. In the longer term, right now we are having this argument with the government. That's for us. But for the people, I'm saying, please get vaccinated. Get your families, your friends, your neighbors, implore on them, encourage them, help them to get vaccinated.
It is
My
very
message
important.
to people listening outside, and as I said this before, I want to thank all of you again. You live in countries where you have the freedom to speak, where you enjoy the fruits of freedom and democracy. But also, I want to encourage all of you to keep supporting our people here, and I want to thank all of you again and again, that you are keeping many families in this country, uh, in a way that they are able to look after themselves. So please, continue to support them, continue to encourage them, and also encourage them to get vaccinated when you talk to them.
That's been great. Now, I'll move ahead to the next subject, which is corruption. Now, the corruption is one thing, but the rate of corruption is basically rising in Fiji. Why is that so?
Well, Param, you say that from Sydney, Australia. I'm sure The government guys won't agree with that. But
Yes.
all I want to say is, of course, there is corruption.
Yes.
And corruption is something that it's not always possible to put your lay your hands on. Obviously, but my concern has been the way in which this government has operated over the last several years in terms of the wastage. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we've talked about this in Parliament. We've discussed about projects, value for money,
Mm-hmm.
and this government doesn't seem to understand this idea of value
Mm-hmm.
for money, because when you are in government, when you are dealing with the taxpayers' money,
Mm-hmm.
if you spend $100 million on a project, you have to make sure that the 100 million that you are spending on a particular project, what value are we getting? Are we
Mm-hmm.
getting a road which is sustainable, which is going to be good for the next 5 years or 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
If you're investing money in a particular project, have you
Mm-hmm.
compared that with something else? Have you looked at as economists, we talk about the opportunity cost,
Mm-hmm.
whether you should be building a bridge this year or next year? These are fundamental questions in terms of how money is used. And one of the problems that I used to be the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, and
Mm-hmm.
government, brought in a change in the standing orders, and now government's person, chairs the Public Accounts Committee. And Public Accounts Committee is fundamentally the most important institution, parliamentary committee in a
Mm-hmm.
parliamentary democracy, where
Mm-hmm.
the and that's why in most cases, in most countries, it's chaired by the member of the opposition to hold the
Mm-hmm.
government to account on every single cent that they spend,
Mm-hmm.
and not only just the allocation of the budget. I mean, the minister for economy in this country is saying, no, 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 public accounts committee only should look at what was the allocation, how the money went. They're not supposed to question government on whether it was the right thing to spend so much money on this particular project. So there's been a lot of wastage.
Mm-hmm.
I gave a figure in Parliament. Of course, government members were yelling from the other side. I said, in my view, about 15 to 20% of government expenditure, especially expenditure on infrastructure and capital works, goes to waste.
Mm-hmm.
And I've said that there's been a lot of lack of transparency, accountability, in terms of how these projects have been undertaken, and there's a lot of chronism and this, I call it this group.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a cabal, which sort of has a hold onto the government of large businesses, and those
Yes.
who save on government,
Yes.
have a lot of conflict of interest, and these are
Mm-hmm.
issues that are important and that needs to be addressed. But this government, seems to be ignoring that.
What do you think the role that FICAC plays in relation to corruption, and
Well,
especially
FICAC,
the councils which are around the country?
FICAC is supposed to be an independent institution,
Mm-hmm.
and government maintains that it's independent.
Mm-hmm.
Other views about FICAC is very different. This has
Mm-hmm.
been articulated in Parliament, but an institution like that is important.
Mm-hmm.
If it does what it's supposed to do, if it operates in an independent manner, but if it gets into a situation where its objective is not to deal with corruption in an independent, transparent, open manner,
Mm-hmm.
then obviously people will have a lot of questions, and I think there are a lot of questions raised by people around that idea that
Mm-hmm.
particular institutions, not just
Mm-hmm.
FICAC but other institutions, may not be independent. But that's a
Mm-hmm.
matter for investigation and inquiry, and this is another thing that this government is very afraid. I mean, we've called
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of bipartisan committees, inquiries through motions,
Mm-hmm.
and all of them have been defeated. I mean, you have this quite frequently in Australia. You have a
Mm-hmm.
banking inquiry, you have
Yes.
inquiries, with respect to so many things, and
Yes.
sometimes these are really bipartisan inquiries. And
Mm-hmm.
what comes out of that is to help the governments, to help the country. It's
Yes.
not
Very true.
necessarily about going after people, but
Yes.
it's about improving the strength of the institutions to be able to do good for the country.
Mm-hmm. Now, Professor Biman, the question I would like to ask you as an outsider, because I often come to Fiji and I visit, why are the prices of goods and services so high?
Well, Param, that's interesting question, and there are a lot of. I could give you a long answer and do a good economics explanation as to why
Mm-hmm.
inflation or the prices may be high, and there are several factors. I mean, first
Mm-hmm.
of all, exchange rate, where we buy from, what's happening to prices internationally,
Mm-hmm.
but there are also reasons about what government does domestically in terms of taxes, in terms of
Yes.
charges. For example, if you keep raising the port charges and goods come and land on the port,
Mm-hmm.
the businesses don't pay for that. All they do
Yes.
is simply pass on to the consumers. So there are several factors that has led to, and we when we come into government, of course, we're
Mm-hmm.
going to look at all those factors and pinpoint where government can intervene
Mm-hmm.
to keep the prices, particularly the prices of basic food items and things that people need on a daily basis, and those that
Yes.
cannot afford in normal circumstances, that
Mm-hmm.
they do not or they are not at a disadvantage. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, I mean, there are several factors
It's an
why,
interesting.
for example, I'll give you an example. When they reduced the VAT from 15 to 10%,
Yes.
when the VAT rate was 15%, there was an exemption on basic food items. So
Yes.
there was no VAT on basic food items. They reduced the tax from 15 to 9%, but they put 9% on basic food items.
Mm-hmm.
So people in the lower income level, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
who spend all their money on basic food, like if
Yes.
you receive only $90 a week,
True.
uh, you know, uh, you're likely to spend all that $90 on food. And if
Might
you
not
put
be
a
enough
tax
though.
on, yeah, may not be enough. But if you put a tax on those goods, so people's income would be further stretched,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was a bad policy.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I say there are a number of factors, one, you can put it into the category of deliberate government policy, which
Mm-hmm.
can be looked at, and the other, of course, is what's happening internationally and where we are getting our imports.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, what government does, in terms of raising the charges at the airport. For example, if frozen goods come through airports,
Mm-hmm.
or if people are coming, depends on what the airport charges are. You know,
Mm-hmm.
tourist numbers, for example, the decision that people make, to come to Fiji, they
Mm-hmm.
look at the airfares, they look at the hotel
Yes.
rates, they look at
Yes.
the departure tax, which is probably one
Yes.
of the highest, or was one of the highest for us, compared to many countries around the world.
Yes. 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 Very true. Well, it's very interesting. Now, the youth of this country, what are they doing these days? I mean, I haven't seen many youth entering into politics or parliament. Now, what is happening with the youth?
I think, Param, that's a very good question, and I think we need to understand that many of these people, who were 10 years old in 2006, would be like 26 years old now.
Yes.
Somebody who, so you can do the calculations of the percentage of youth who would
Mm-hmm.
be in jobs, who would be professionals, who would be ready to get into parliament or get active
Mm-hmm.
into politics. There's been a lot of disincentive. First of
Mm-hmm.
all, we didn't have democracy, from 2006, December 2006, right up to 2014. And then when we ended up,
Just lost him there for a second. I think he'll be back on that interesting.
And
That's
then
very
when we had the constitution, which
yeah.
was imposed on the people of Fiji, and we still have all the draconian laws that were put in place during the interim administration,
Mm-hmm.
is now still, embedded into the constitution. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of young people and a lot of women have this very, very challenging environment in front of them. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
barriers, to
Yes.
get into politics.
Yes.
And when you have a situation where you don't have that kind of freedom,
Mm.
where there is fear, there's a lot of fear about getting into politics
Okay.
in
Okay.
Fiji right now. There are a lot of people who do not want to openly identify themselves with a particular party. Unlike in
Mm.
Australia, you have students in
Yes.
forming political party branch in universities.
Yes.
You have
Yes.
this
Of
thing in
course.
schools. Businessmen are not afraid of
Yes.
siding with the opposition or with the government. In Fiji, that is the reality.
Mm-hmm.
Businessmen tell me, quite often, no, I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to be seen with you. I might lose a contract. These are real fears that people have.
Mm.
But I think there is a lot of knowledge out there amongst the youth. We have
Mm-hmm.
some good group of activists, and I really like a lot of the things they say. They are not afraid. They're able to put government on the spot. They're able to put opposition on the spot,
Mm-hmm.
and we've had a lot of criticisms from some of these people as well, and I
Mm-hmm.
encourage that. I have no
Yes.
issues, youth saying, what is Biman Prasad doing, what did he say, about a particular policy. That's fine. And my view in the party, and I think we are trying very hard. We've got a
Mm-hmm.
good young group of people, who understand politics, and we need to bring a lot of young people. It's not just enough to
True.
say, oh, we're doing this for the young people. We're giving scholarships. We are giving. That's fine. Every government does that. Some do better than the others,
Mm-hmm.
but governments also need to give out the signal that
Mm-hmm.
the young people have an opportunity to get into politics. That they would be that we have to remove that fear,
Mm-hmm.
and we when we get into government, and I, as the leader of a party and somebody
Mm-hmm.
who's come out of student politics,
Mm-hmm.
encourage everyone, to join political parties. In another interview, I said to them, I said, you don't have to necessarily join the National Federation Party. Join any political party that you, but please, get into
Yes.
politics. As
Yes.
I said, politics can be a good, force for good. And if we are
Yes.
not participating in politics, if we are not joining political parties, if we are not
Mm-hmm.
holding leaders to account, and if we don't ourselves as young people get into politics,
Mm-hmm.
then you can't make a, a, a lot of difference. I mean, some people tell me, we can make a difference from being outside. That's fine. and
Mm-hmm.
and we appreciate that a lot of people who make valuable contribution by not coming into politics. But ultimately, the politics determines some of the big policy agenda,
Mm-hmm.
and young people need to be part of that. And I would encourage, our party encourages people to join us and
Mm-hmm.
be part of politics and hold leaders to
Yes.
account as well.
Yeah, very true. Now, in 2014, the Fiji First Party had a landslide victory. Now, what happened in 2018 that it was only 50%? What is it
Yeah,
telling you?
well, 2014 they had 59% of the vote, and
Yes.
which under the proportional representation system or the Dihon system that we have, they had 59% of the seats.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they had lost about 9%
Yes.
within 4 years,
Yes.
and Fiji First almost lost the election.
Yes.
But that too, after massive spending before the election, and that
Mm-hmm.
was part of the reason why we ran short of money in 2019, because the
Mm-hmm.
government was just obsessed with winning an election
Okay.
and not looking at the future, in terms of what the budgetary provision would be. So they spent a lot of money before the election, and I would say, a lot of it was a vote buying scheme.
Okay. Okay.
And we've said this before, and I'm not I'm not hesitant to say that again.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I mean, people can people can be gullible at times.
Mm-hmm.
We all can be gullible,
Mm-hmm.
but people know what's behind the politics. Eventually,
Mm.
people understand that, and I have
Yes.
a lot of faith in the people.
Mm-hmm.
I think if any political leader or if any political party thinks that they can take people for granted that they'll
Yes.
always be with them,
Yes.
then that will be foolishness. People are smarter than what politicians sometimes think.
Yes. Very true.
People make their decisions
Mm-hmm.
at a particular point in time. And I think Fiji is no different. Our people are no different. Our
Mm-hmm.
people, whether they are farmers, whether they are young people, whether they are educated or not, I think people
Mm-hmm.
have a certain level of wisdom
Mm-hmm.
through which they can see what government is doing, what the opposition might do, and what
Mm-hmm.
might be in store for them in the future. And on that basis, I think people will vote in the next election.
Okay, it'll be interesting because I saw the results of I followed the 214 and 218, and now the projection is kind of different. We hear stories, but obviously the 222 election will be different. And as you said, the bond buying scheme though it has happened. The past is the past. Now, I've got two more questions before we'll take some, if you have some time, we'll take some questions from the forum. But the first question I would like to ask you, Professor, is that Fiji First has been ruling since 2014, and in 2018 they were voted back into the election. Now, what good have they done to the country? I mean, as an opposition, you would say, yes, of course, they haven't done so many things. Now, what good do you think they have done to the country?
Well, the main operators in the Fiji First Party have not been in government for 6 years. They've been in government since 2006. So
Six. Yes.
a lot of the things that has happened or has not happened in the country is the rest on them. They have a direct responsibility
Mm-hmm.
of whether we have done well or not. I think, to be fair, I mean, every government does certain things that people appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are things that this government did, in terms of extending the free education, which was a partly free scheme in the past, and many people appreciated, that.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that this government did, in terms of bringing in laws to look at, the violence against women, social welfare, payments were increased. So there are you can identify a number of social policy
Mm-hmm.
areas, social protection policies, which you can say was relevant, and any government, which breaks about, a significant economic growth, which this government did,
Mm-hmm.
ought to do that anyway. And so, those are positive things that you can identify. But
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of other things that we can identify, and we can blame this government. One, for example, is the sugar industry. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we were producing about 3 million tons of cane in 2006. But since the coup in 2006, we've gone down
Mm-hmm.
to 1.5, 1.6 million tons of cane.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the sugar industry is reduced to a small, pocket size industry.
Industry, yes.
FSC is almost, insolvent. So, there are a lot of issues. We haven't done much, in terms of non-sugar agriculture sectors.
Mm-hmm.
Tourism industry is where this government, put all its effort. In some ways, they put all the eggs in one basket.
Mm-hmm.
And look, nobody predicted a pandemic, but the pandemic has really destroyed the tourism industry, and we
Mm-hmm.
don't have much to fall back on. And I think the point that I want to make in relation to that is, going forward, we need
Mm-hmm.
to think seriously how to reset the whole economic infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
the structure of the economy, whether we should put lot more emphasis on agriculture, how do we reset the tourism industry, how do we look at the manufacturing, informal sector, IT
Mm-hmm.
industries. A lot of rethinking will have to be done in terms of, and we need to start doing that soon. And we in the opposition will do that when we go into the election into 2022. We are going to go with a very clear thinking as to
Mm-hmm.
what we need to do, because COVID would have changed the whole world. It has changed the
Yes.
world.
Yes,
Every
very true.
country would be looking at how to do things in a post-COVID environment. And for us, it is going to be a much bigger imperative to understand how we can reset ourselves and put ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
in the global community to be
Yes.
able to derive the benefits and success that people would need, going
Mm-hmm.
forward.
Now, the last question I would like to personally ask you is, if you were to be voted into the next election, and supposedly you were the leader of the opposition or the ruling party, example, the ruling party, and you became the prime minister. Now, sir, how would you do things? What changes or what things would you bring to the society or in Fiji as a whole that people would look into you and say, "Look, we have faith in this gentleman."
Well, first of all, we will practice real democracy. We will allow people to criticize us. We'll listen to the people. We will take a very consultative approach in terms of economic policy. As I
Mm-hmm.
said before, we will have a very clear, manifesto, a strategy as to how we are going to take the country forward in the post-COVID environment,
Mm-hmm.
and making sure that people are not left behind, because there would be many people, as I said before,
Mm-hmm.
in the next 1 year and 18 months or 2 years, that would be really struggling to make ends meet. There will be hundreds of small businesses that
Mm-hmm.
would be struggling to reestablish themselves. And so we are going to have some very, very clear policies uh, to take the country forward.
And in closing, before I take, you okay? Do you have some time to take some questions from the forum
Sure,
there,
sure,
Prasad?
sure.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know, I don't quite understand, but I'll put these questions on the screen here. How much money was used to change the Fiji flag?
Well, I can't remember the exact amount, but I think it was quite a substantial amount, and
Okay.
the flag was not changed because there was a lot of opposition and a lot of young people, opposed it.
Okay. And the next question here is: all politicians are the same brothers till they hold the portfolio. Back in the days, my dad and us lost so much of us can harvest when FLP and Chaudhary used farmers for strikes. Nothing much will change with politics. Okay, that's Azad Ali. There's another question
I,
here.
I,
That's
I think, I mean, if I just make a
yes.
comment on what Azad said, I mean, I can understand the cynicism. I think people have a right to be cynical about politicians,
Mhm.
because
And they should, shouldn't
you
they?
know yeah, they because in the bigger scheme of things, sometimes, you have politicians, who keep only thinking about politics. Good politics does not always mean, good policies. So there's always this balancing act between good politics and good policy.
Mhm.
But as an economist, I want to say to the people that politics can be a force for good, and we don't have to compromise good policy for good politics all the time.
Mhm.
Politics is not necessarily just about winning an election. And for me personally, it's never been about just
Money. Yeah.
just getting into power. As an opposition, as I said, in a democracy, the opposition is as important as the government,
True.
because part of the policy making, part of the change that can come, as a force for good through politics,
Mhm.
can come, if you have a robust democracy, if you have
Mhm.
a robust political environment where the opposition can articulate their views and they're well resourced, where there is a robust media, which we don't have. and
Yes.
and that is why some of the things that has happened in this country is partly because we don't have that kind of real democracy that one ought to practice and
Hmm.
have. So I can understand what Azad is saying, that people can very quickly develop this kind of very cynical view about what politicians want at the end of the day.
Will you promise not to take people into legal custody and butaki them if
Of
they
course,
cross
of course not.
the...
Of course not. In a democracy, there is no place for that kind of stupidity. Stupidity,
Well, there's a question here. Say, why isn't the minimum wages rate in Fiji being increased?
Well, Abdul's asked a very good question. I
Hmm.
mean, some people might say, if you talk about raising the minimum wage now, the employers. I mean, you remember in 2018 election when some of us were talking about raising the minimum wages to $4 to $5.
Hmm.
There was this big, group, this cabal of, business cronies
Hmm.
who actually were threatening the workers, who were siding with the government, taking government ministers to their factories. Government manufacturers, took government ministers to their factories,
Hmm.
warning that they will lose jobs. So, there's a lot of misinformation that was created when we talked about a decent, living wage. When we talk
Hmm.
about minimum, we talked about a living wage, a
Hmm.
wage rate on the basis of which people can have some decent living, at least meet the
Hmm.
minimum requirements.
Yes.
So it's been and this government had promised to relook at the minimum wage of $2.68. It's almost 2 years now they haven't been able to do that. But that's something that we will look at carefully when we come into government, given the post-pandemic situation and the
Hmm.
impact that it has had on the economy.
Yes. Yeah, so Neil Chand's asking what exactly were the government members doing on the level line of 48 hours? It's probably something
Well,
that you would know.
well, well, probably my answer to that would be for Sunil to actually ask the Minister for Economy, who was leading the pack, I suppose at that point in time.
Hmm.
He will be able to tell the people of this country what they were doing. He talked about, a policy discussion and identifying the low-hanging fruits, but that's all we know.
Fiji media is gagged, censored. We get more news from the social media than mainstream media. Do you promise to lift media censorship and free media?
Absolutely important question. The first thing we will do is to remove the draconian media decree, because as
Okay.
a result of that media decree, which was implemented during the interim government's time, that has killed, in many ways, the media freedom. And there are unfortunately some media organizations, who work in cahoot with the government, who benefit from government's advertising and so forth, and parrot, government propaganda, and they are doing a lot of disservice to the people of this country. As I said,
Hmm.
a media in a democracy, is very important, because sometimes more than the opposition, because if the media doesn't amplify the voice of the opposition,
True.
then you cannot hold the government to account.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, you'll be surprised, Param. There are television stations in this country who even refuse to take our views. I mean, in Australia, if the government minister says one thing, you'll have a mic here with the minister, you'll have another mic with the opposition. Here,
Yes.
we have to call the media organizations to come and interview us. They still don't come. And if you
Mm.
issue a statement, nothing will come. There are very few, media organizations, probably two,
Hmm.
one or two, who give some space to the opposition. So very important question. And in a democracy, if you don't have that, if you don't have the media freedom, I mean,
Hmm.
you people are living in a country where you see how the media, how robust the media
Yes.
is, in terms of questioning not only just the government but also the opposition. And we are saying, so what is happening here? And some media organizations, all they look for is how they can get something bad on the opposition, and they put the opposition on the spot instead of putting the government on the spot.
Yes. It should
So
be.
it
It
is
should be
it's a very
equal.
difficult situation. Yeah.
Yes. Fiji has never improved on medical services. In fact, it has deteriorated with time. People can't afford Panadols. People with chronic diseases do not have medication and die. Do you think if you guys came into power, you would improve the medical services?
Uh, Param, if you and I would urge Ashish to look at our manifesto for 2018, and as I said before on this show, that our main focus when we come into government would be to look at how we can improve the health services. And
Mhm.
I have said this on many occasions. We have moved motion in Parliament calling for an inquiry into
Mhm.
the health services of this country. We have said in Parliament only recently, that health centers and hospitals don't have medicine. We've proven that
Mhm.
we are right. People are calling us. So he's absolutely right that under this government, the medical services, the state of our hospitals, health centers has deteriorated to an extent, which I would call shameful, shameful.
Mhm.
And we would put in a lot of effort in making sure, because health is very important. When people get to the hospital,
Mhm.
it's like, getting into a temple, where you expect all the respect, in terms of the services, in terms of what
Mhm.
is available. That's how health centers, hospitals ought to be. In
Mhm.
fact, I remember a health center in my village in Triketi in the 70s. It was much better
Mhm.
resourced. It was clean, tidy. I
Mhm.
went to the health center and I talked to the doctors and nurses, and I was like ashamed. I
Mhm.
couldn't believe my eyes. And so I actually put out a picture, and I said to the government and the minister for health that do something and at least paint the place. So yes, I
Mhm.
think Ashish is absolutely right. When he points out, the deteriorating state of health services in this country.
Now, Akshay Kumar, he's saying, how can National Federation Party help us fight this pandemic?
Well, Akshay, that's a good question. And as you understand, as I've said before, that we are not in control of the government. We're not in control of the resources. What we have been doing is offering government, very good ideas. I put out a 3-point plan, only recently, that the government should follow. We're doing our bit in terms of helping the people, encouraging people to vaccinate. As leaders, we've made videos, we've shown people, publicly that we are taking the jabs. Please do that. So we're doing our bit to help the Ministry of Health, the permanent secretary, asking people to follow the protocols, behave in an appropriate way so that we stop. So, the opposition is doing whatever we can do. But
Mhm.
more important, our role is to hold the government to account, to ask the hard questions, suggest alternatives. And if they don't, and if we feel that the government is not doing the right thing, then our job, is to use forums like this, media, to actually
Yes.
talk about what government needs to do and what it shouldn't do. So
Yes,
I
it's
think we've been doing that very, very effectively.
it's a well answered there, Professor Biman. Rahul Raj is saying, hello. So, why was EFL sold, not FSC? Why was
That's
EFL
a
sold?
very pertinent question, Rahul. Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent question, because you had that's an essential utility, right? And this
Okay.
government has been talking about how EFL or the former FEA has been doing so well. I mean, if we are doing so well, why do we need to sell that? That's the question that the government needs to answer. They say, this is a foreign investment, but it doesn't make sense to sell a
Utility, country's
national
utility.
utility organization when you
Yes. Yes.
yeah, when you keep claiming that it is doing very well. So we've not had a satisfactory answer to the questions that have been raised as to why EFL has not been EFL shares have been sold to a foreign investor.
Well, I don't think any country should sell the utilities because in today's day and era, it is very important to get hold of them, keep hold of them. Especially, you've seen within the Pacific, so many countries are trying to get into the Pacific. And a place like Fiji, who wouldn't like to get their hands hold on them? Would you like to take a few more questions before we round up for today, sir?
Sure. A few more questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you should much. Okay, that's not the one. That's the one here. This
Thank you,
question is saying
Poonam.
why Fiji Airlines bought more planes.
Well, the that question can be answered only by the Minister for Economy. But we have raised some very, very important questions. After the pandemic, the Parliament, the opposition supported the government guarantee, to keep the airline afloat, in terms of the extra loan. But in the last Parliament, when the government brought a motion to uh, renew the guarantee, we did not support it because we wanted, seriously, very clear, transparent, accountable information as to what was the state of the airline, what was its future. And this government, let me say, having the majority share, refused to bring annual reports to Parliament. So the government was making the decision, but never brought this, the accountability part to Parliament. And so there are a lot of questions as to how these decisions were made, from change right from the day ago, when they changed from Boeing to Airbus, what was the reason for that, how new lease arrangements were made, some of the details that we've had a robust debate in Parliament. We are still not satisfied that we got all the answers, and we are still not satisfied as to what the future of the airline is going to be. And where we are at this point, we don't seem to have all the detailed information that ought to come to Parliament. And that is why in the last session of Parliament, we did not support the guarantee that the government sought from Parliament. Of course, government has a majority, it was approved, but the opposition didn't vote for it.
Now, the last question for today is why are the overseas residents with dual citizenships not allowed to contest for politicians' position? Is there something we can do about it? Now,
Well,
if your
that's
party comes into power, I suppose.
yeah, that's an important question, and all I would say at this stage is that we should have more conversation about it. Right now, the provision in the Constitution and the laws that emanate from the Constitution suggests that you can only contest the election if you are a citizen of Fiji and you don't already have citizenship. Many countries around the world, have that provision, but it does not mean that we should not have a conversation about it, as to whether we should allow people with dual citizenship to contest elections in Fiji.
Okay, as a personal friend of mine, Mr. Anil Kumar, who is a dentist, he still carries a dual citizenship. Actually, he does carry Fijian passport, I think. A lot of the laws in place currently were not properly passed in Parliament. They are draconian. Do you promise to urgently...
I think Anil, yeah, I think Anil has asked a very good question, and he's absolutely right. As I said, Param, earlier, so some of the decrees that were put in place, during the interim government, when the new constitution was put in place, those decrees were preserved in the new constitution under Section 173 and probably 174 as well. And in Parliament, through a motion, they were all deemed to be acts of Parliament. Now, we promised that in 2014, we promised that in 2018 election, that when we come into government, we will throw out some of those draconian pieces of legislation which
Mhm.
became acts of parliament after.
That's a little glitch that happens with the camera, but he will still reiterate when he comes back.
Uh,
There you go.
after, and we promise that when we come into government, we are going to get rid of some of those draconian decrees. The other point that Anil is probably referring to in that question is also the fact that many of the laws have been rushed through in Parliament and under what we call the Standing Order 51, where
Mhm.
you bring a bill on Monday and you debate on Thursday and approve it. And we've
Mhm.
said this on many occasions. There are some where Order 51 is okay, like small changes. That's fine. We've accepted. We've supported bills of that nature. But there've been some substantial bills which have a lot of implications on how, what would it mean for the people generally and those who might be affected, that have been
Mhm.
rushed through. And I've said this, there's that laws need to be made properly. It's better to have a law that takes a while to be approved than to
Mhm.
rush a law and end up with a lot of unintended consequences. And I think
Mhm.
that is what has happened in this parliament over the last 5 or 6 years, that some laws have been rushed, and the unintended consequences of that law on the people, on institutions, on stakeholders has not been very, very good, and it's actually been detrimental to the interest of those stakeholders and for the country as a whole.
Now, lastly, as a leader of the National Federation Party, what would be your call towards all those voters that are proposing to come on board for the 2022 election and support the party? What is your view on that, sir?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really don't want to talk about the election at this point. I mean, we are going through a deadly pandemic and a messed up, strategy by this government to actually control the virus. But all I want to say to our people is that, we intend to provide a very clear, democratic, consultative government, when we come into power. And people can trust us. People can trust us to do this in a transparent, accountable, and an efficient manner. I also want to say that I invite everyone, especially our young people, to actively participate in politics. Don't fear about what the government will say or do. I think it is your right, even though the climate may not be that free, but it is your right to participate in politics and be accountable to whatever happens in the country, so that you can make a difference to what happens after the election and what the next government does. Because if you participate, if you make your views known, you can have an impact on what the next government will do.
Well, as I said, that they always have to has an opposition, because if there's no opposition, there's no democratic ruling. There's only one ruling party then. Well, Professor Biman
Absolutely.
Prasad, thank you for your time and much appreciated. And hopefully we can do more of this session in future as we develop
Yeah.
into the coming elections in 2022. But a last word of from advice from yourself to the people that are listening to this program. Yeah, in respect to the pandemic that is happening at the moment, and before we sign off.
Thank you, Param. It's been a pleasure to be on this show, and I thank you very much for facilitating this. All I want to say to people here in Fiji, watching this, is please, observe all the pandemic is out of control. We are in a very serious situation. Please, take all precautions, follow all the health measures, maintain social distancing, wear masks, wash your hands with soap whenever you get out. only go out, as the permanent secretary for health said, if you need to, and please get everyone to get vaccinated. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell your family members, support them, facilitate them to get vaccinated, and let's all give hope to ourselves. I am hopeful that we would be able to eventually get through this. But as opposition leaders, we will keep putting pressure on the government on your behalf. I know there are many people who are struggling to make ends meet. On that aspect, we are putting a lot of pressure on government to allocate funds in the next budget. We are saying to our international donors, please direct some funds to our NGOs who are doing a lot of good job. And I want to thank the NGOs for really getting down, holding this government to account, and also at the same time helping our people. So thank you, everyone. And finally, thank you to all our overseas viewers. And let me just repeat, because I want to repeat this. I want to thank all of you for looking after your families, your friends, your village people, your settlements, by sending remittances and making sure that these people don't go hungry, in a particular day. So, big binaka bakalebu, dhanyawad, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Biman. And that was Professor Biman helping us on this program today. Hopefully, you would have got some insight into the current affair of Fiji, the politics, what's happening in Fiji. It is a very touchy subject, and I hope you would have gathered something. Do fire me some questions, hit my page, Fiji Indian TV, and get more information. And of course, yes, if you need me to interview the other party, we always welcome. I'm always looking for some oppositions or some context where I can bring forward and talk to them and put him in front of you so you could decide yourself who to vote, who not to vote. As I always say, the politicians are there to run the country, but they work for the people, not for themselves. They work for the people. So with that, I would leave you here, and I would like to thank you, and I say big Vinaka Bakalevu, Nisamode, and thank you for joining me on this program, and a very big thank you to Ranjit Raju as well as Professor Biman. It has been a wonderful pleasure. Do join us on Fiji Indian TV. Thank you for listening. Vinaka Bakalevu and Nisamode.